This is Extra Paycheck Podcast, episode number 85.
You're listening to Extra Paycheck Podcast, where you will learn how to build and grow your own successful online business. Now, here's your host, Alex Soul.
Welcome to yet another episode of Extra Paycheck Podcast. This is episode number 85, and in today's episode, I've got a very special guest for you. His name is Bill Kerr. He started his own business, and this business has been growing and booming for the past couple of years. And Bill will be sharing his experience, his story, and his tips so you could start and run a better business. Enjoy today's episode. Hi, Bill, and welcome to the Extra Paycheck Podcast.
Alex, hey, thanks for having me.
Bill, please tell us a little bit more about yourself and what is that you do as a business.
Okay, so my name's Bill Kerr. I go by the name of Doc. Doc's my nickname. I get called that every day rather than Bill. Bill's only really when I'm in trouble. But as far as Adventure Fit goes, so I've got a company called Adventure Fit Travel, which is it's an adventure travel company for the fitness community. Basically, what we do is we're a tour provider. So we will package group holidays for like-minded people in the fitness community. So I'll plan an adventure itinerary. That can be anywhere around the world. We'll train throughout that holiday, and then I'll get high-level coaches and athletes to come along and join us to for the guests to learn from. So it's small group travel, numbers of up to 14 normally, and then we also have just started a podcast, which is going really well as well. So that's Adventure Fit Radio. So that's kind of the two sides of the coin, I suppose, when it comes to Adventure Fit.
Mm-hmm. And the podcast, I guess, is on the same subject. It goes along with your tour company.
Well, not particularly. So we have all of our database. We have about a 15,000 strong database, mailing list, and about 50,000 on the socials, and they're all kind of fitness fanatics, I suppose you would call for the most part. But myself and my co-host, so I'm one of the hosts of the podcast. We have the bulk of our shows are probably health and fitness related, so maybe 60%, and then there's 40% that are travel and just general things that interest us in life. So our slogan for our podcast is actually fitness, adventure, and life, and we just want to tell cool stories from all walks of the globe. We've had astronauts and philosophers and UFC fighters. We've had all kinds of, along with the adventure and the fitness side of it as well. So we just try and talk to people that we're genuinely interested to talk to.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting, man. And I was curious, how would you even come up with such a niche idea? How did you know that there's a demand for this kind of thing? Because I go to the gym when I can, and I know a lot of people, they love fitness, and that's pretty much what they spend their time on. Then I love traveling, and I've met a lot of travelers and everywhere around the world, but it's like two really different worlds. How did you come up with actually figuring out there's an industry, there's a demand for people who want to travel yet spend most of the time doing fitness while traveling? That's really unique.
Yeah, for sure. It's a question that I often get asked, and for me, I'm an act first, think later, think second kind of guy. So it wasn't like I'd done lots of research and figured out that there was a hole in the market there. It's basically it started through a couple of things, and one of them was I was just trying to scratch my own itch. So I'm 30 years old now. When I was 24, I started traveling. And traveled profusely for about 4 years. I went through probably 35 countries or something like that, backpacking all around the world, and it was great. It was a really good run. And I was by no means a fitness fanatic, but I did like fitness, and I also just liked when I was traveling to do a little bit of fitness on the side, because then it makes you just feel better about yourself. Because if you've traveled, then you know that you're not eating the regular type of food, so your immune system's probably down a little bit. You're probably on long buses and uncomfortable flights. You're probably partying more than you would normally party. It's just a whole to keep your body and your mind in a good state. Then you want to be kind of trying to look after yourself and do good things at the same time. So when I was traveling myself, I would always say, for example, I was 24, Alex, so you can imagine traveling through South America and places like this. I was partying a lot. But what I would do is I would make sure if I was going out overnight, then I would make sure I'd go down to the beach and spend 20 minutes on the beach doing a workout, or I'd go for a surf and then go for a run, or whatever I was doing. I was making sure I was doing something active, because then it made me feel good about myself, and it made me feel like I'd earned the beers that I was going to go drink that night. So that was just kind of how I liked to travel. That was one of the things. And then how it actually came to be was I was working in the fitness industry and wanted to start a gym, but I knew that if I started a gym, then that would take up a lot of my time, and it would make it a lot harder for me to keep traveling, which is one of my biggest passions, if not my biggest passion. So the original plan was to have a gym, have however many members we have, and then offer seasonal holidays or just adventures for my gym and for my community. So maybe 10 people might come over and we'll do some stuff in New Zealand, or because we're obviously in Australia. I'm in Melbourne, Australia, so I'm right next to New Zealand, which is adventure capital of the world, really. And then the thing was, the gym didn't end up working out. So I was at a crossroads where I was like, okay, I have this really good idea, but I can't really get this gym across the line. I thought maybe I just take this idea that I have for the travel, and maybe I just open it up to the general populace and just see if it sells. And then with one graphic design poster and a Facebook page, no website, no mailing list, no anything, I sold 10 tickets on our first trip, and then Adventure Fit was born.
Wow, man, I'm just trying to get my head wrapped around that. That's really awesome. And could you share, what was the price point for this trip?
Yeah, so the price point for the trip, the first trip was definitely too cheap. I found that out later. But the price point for 10 days was 3,599 AUD, Australian dollars. So at today's rates, something like maybe 2,900 US dollar.
Yeah.
So it's a big ticket item for sure. It's not like in Australia we have one of the biggest travel companies in the world, Intrepid Travel, which is budget travel for backpackers and young people. It's definitely not quite that, because we have a lot of overheads with the high level coaches and athletes we get over there. So it's a little higher than your budget stuff, but it's below your premium grade travel as well.
Yeah, of course, and I understand that. And you're not in the business of strictly travel or budget traveling, so that's fine. I'm sure you could buy tours for $100,000 and more for just a few days, if you would look for them. But
that's right.
That's the thing. You're targeting a different audience. You're not targeting a budget travelers.
Mm-hmm.
And Bill, so you did your very first trip, and I guess you deemed it a success because you kept on going. So my question here is, how did you grow that business?
Yeah, so growth was a funny thing, because I worked in construction basically I was a real estate investor when I was young, so I was involved in money. I bought and sold real estate since I was 19. But as far as running a business went, I was in construction, and then I entered the fitness industry a few years later. So I really had no business acumen whatsoever. And that carried over into my early days of Adventure Fit. But the good thing is, I'm very driven and I'm very obsessive when it comes to something that I'm focusing on. So when I was a real estate investor, I was subscribed to the two biggest real estate magazines in Australia, and I'd read them back to front every month. When I entered the fitness industry, then it was strength training journals and weightlifting journals and all these fitness journals that I would just pour through. And then when I became an entrepreneur, that it kind of became business. So I'm self-taught in most things that I do, but early on it was very, very tough. So the second trip, we found the first trip so easy to sell. We sold 10 spots with a Facebook page with a few hundred followers, that we decided to run the second trip straight away, back to back. Probably not back to back, but 2 months apart. We went back to New Zealand, and I thought, okay, well, if we sold 10 that easily that time around, we've got proof of concept here, and we've got all these awesome photos and videos, then surely the second one will sell so much better. I'd made a couple of mistakes there. I made a mistake in putting it way too close to Christmas, which is hard for people to travel. Right before it was started December 8th. But also, it was just harder than I thought. So we sold 4 tickets on the second trip, and at that point, that lost or cost us a lot of money. So at that point, I thought, okay, I have to get serious about this. And I didn't have any sort of database, any sort of newsletter. I was only on a few of the social media channels. So basically, in the early days, it started off by what I would do is I would just try and get in the face of people that were smarter than me. So I've got lots of friends that are in marketing, friends that are in sales, friends that are business owners, and I would try and just buy them lunch, catch up and have a chat, shoot the shit, and then find out what had worked for them or what hadn't. And that kind of really, really helped me early on. So I would have a mate that would come up and catch up with me, and we would go through things. He would say, okay, where are you at with your business? And early days, it was like, okay, I've just started my Instagram account. How should I be managing that? And so on and so forth. This is so far so far in the past now. But then probably every 3 to 4 to 5 months, he would come and I had a couple of other sounding boards that would look at where I'm at with this stage of my business, and then they would help me kind of create the path for where I should go next. So, okay, I'm going to start a podcast. How do you think I should go about this? And my mailing list is at this point, what should I be doing with my newsletters and what should the customer sales process look like? So basically, but that's probably waffling on a little bit. But to answer your question more succinctly, we've grown our business through social media. We've got Instagram's our biggest driver, and we also have come up with some different strategies to grow our database. And our database is at now 15,000, and that's our biggest driver, pretty much for sales on the trips.
Mm-hmm. Really awesome, man, and really interesting. And I guess, as you said, whatever you did in life, you usually got really into it and you try to, know and learn as much as you possibly can. And I see that's the kind of thing you did about entrepreneurship and, more importantly, about online entrepreneurship. It feels like you try to learn every single trick and every single technique there to at least have an idea what it is, what it does, and why it should be implemented in your business.
Yeah, 100%. I think just you've got to find out what works for you. And at the moment, Adventure Bits, we're still working things out to some extent as well. So lately I've been looking at okay, how do travel bloggers make their residual incomes? So because we've also built a team of 40 bloggers that would write content and share content on our site. But we hadn't really been able to monetize that in any way. So I was thinking of ways and looking at ways to get residual income coming in off our site with affiliate links through, you can Amazon affiliate links and there's lots of different companies that will give you a percentage if you have display ads on the side of your site. These are things that I haven't really got right into, but this is the newest thing that I'm looking at, and we're about to start a YouTube channel. So it's always just step by step for me. And if something doesn't work, then I'll trial it and see how it plays out. But normally most things have kind of stuck, which has been pretty good and pretty lucky because I don't like to start something and then have it kind of fall by the wayside. But yeah, I'm always just always listening to podcasts, reading blog articles, and just trying to figure out what will work for me. Because with the big ticket items that we sell, it's not because we're only 2 years in, Alex, so we're going quite well, but we're also not as predictable with our sales as we'd like. So with the big ticket items, hopefully in a couple of years, that's absolutely predictable income because we've dialed it in. But at the moment, it's not. So we've had to kind of figure out ways to get more of a residual income coming in through our podcast and through monetizing our site a little bit. So it's always just a learning process for me, and I get excited by it.
Yeah, sure. That makes a lot of sense. And in the past, I've made mistakes of putting all my eggs in one basket and losing a big source of income or main source of income for whatever reason. And sometimes it happens. You can't predict everything that's going to happen in the world. So I always tell people that it's a really, really good idea to create as many income streams for your business as possible. And if you're building an online presence such as a blog, video blog on YouTube and many other platforms, there are ways to monetize those without necessarily selling your main product. You just, as you said, supplement that income with different income streams. That's a very smart way to go about it, especially online where you have the chance to do it. That's
right. And so we haven't started a YouTube channel yet, and our blog's not really making us a lot of money, but our podcast that we started is growing by 30% a month.
Wow.
We're 8 months in, And yeah, it's really going gangbusters. But mind you, we started from very modest listener base, and we're still only really at a very modest base now. But we're starting to get we've got sponsors on board now. We're starting to get income from the podcast, and we're at the point now where we're trying to make the quality of the podcast better. We're going to start this YouTube channel, and then if you kind of extrapolate that over a year into the future, 2 years into the future, sure, we're probably not going to grow by 30% per month. If we did, that's absolutely fantastic. But even if you try and even if you graph that out 15% over 12 months, then we're going to be making really good money from our podcast. So, and that money's consistent, and it's also very easy. So I think for everyone out there, like for me, it was just about finding what worked, and podcasting seems to work. For us, it's pretty stress free. There's not a whole lot of work to it. We have assistants in the Philippines, so I've got 2 assistants for Adventure Fit Travel and 1 for Adventure Fit Radio. So basically, with the podcast, we don't really do anything except for reach out to guests and record the shows, and then once we've done that, we send it over to the Philippines. Our team over there will put it together. They run our social media, all of our database stuff, all of our updates through our newsletter, and it's really fun as well. So that's been a really good addition, and that's only really 8 or 9 months old, and that's been a really good addition to the business, and it's also creating awesome contacts and we're meeting really cool people along the way.
Yeah, that's really awesome, Bill. And I agree with you that a podcast in certain cases could be a really great thing for your brand. In my case, one of the things that I love the most about doing this podcast every week is connecting with people like you and, hearing your advice, hearing your stories, hearing your experience, because that's something that you can't really put any value on, in my opinion.
That's right. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Some of the contacts that we've made through Adventure Fit, obviously we've got a reasonably good name in our industry, but still we get high level coaches and athletes to come on these trips. So they might be gold medalist Olympians. They might be professional gymnasts. They might be CrossFit Games athletes. They might be health and nutritionist speakers. And it's not always easy to get these guys across the line, but so we've managed to make so many amazing contacts through giving these guys a platform. Hey, come chat on our show. They get to know us a little bit. Our show's very, very lighthearted. I've got a co-host and we're both just gooses on the show, but we try and get to some good content as well, obviously. And then you kind of make that personal connection with people, and it's opened so many doors. And even for people that don't have anything to do with Adventure Fit as a business really, or in the future they won't, but have been heroes of mine. We had Chris Hadfield, the Canadian astronaut, on the show, who first man to tweet from space, and the man who sung Space Oddity by David Bowie in the International Space Station. Yeah, he's the man. And I just we got to sit down and have a chat with him. That was via Skype. A lot of our interviews are in person, but that one's via Skype. But just to be able to sit down and ask him the questions that were on my mind, and yeah, it's just a great way to, like you said, connect with people, and also to kind of make connections as well for your business.
Yeah. By the way, I'd like to mention here, because a lot of people are listening to it right now, and some people might be getting a wrong idea that starting a podcast is always profitable, very easy to do. That's very far from the truth, guys. Running a podcast, it's fun and you get to talk with people, but it's not easy per se. Just like starting a blog or a YouTube channel, it takes consistency and it takes a lot of time, and you have to be very active promoting it. You have to put out really good content, and that's what I think, Bill, one of the reasons why your podcast is growing so well is the quality of content. Not necessarily even the quality of sound, because some people will spend $10,000 on equipment and have a really bad podcast. The sound of quality matters, of course, but it's the quality of your content. That's what's important, and the consistency of your show. And from the recent numbers, I've heard that in 2014 and 2015, there have been at least 100,000 new podcasts that were started. And in 2016, there are only 60,000 active podcasts. So as you can see, a lot of people start a podcast for a really wrong reason. Usually, that's the easiest way to make money. So people start these podcasts and then they just leave them because they understand that it's not easy money. It's not a get rich quick scheme. It's work and it's dedication.
Absolutely. We definitely didn't start off profitable. What we did to get off the ground, because at the time, a year ago, we just didn't have a huge lump sum of money that was going to be there to start our show. So what we did is we had a Kickstarter campaign. We sold T-shirts and jumpers, and we also sold some adverts for potential sponsors to come on board before the show actually started. And I mean, some people have Kickstarter campaigns that have amazing results, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars. We didn't have that. We set a goal of $7,500 Australian dollars, so $5.5 US or so, 5,500, and we just wanted to get to that point. We knew that would buy us all of our recording equipment. Like you say, we spent about $1,800 on recording equipment, which was 4 headsets and all our mixers and so forth. We didn't need to, but we could have got off with a $200, $300 probably setup, and we could have got off to a start. But we got a good setup, and we also paid for a little bit of time for getting our podcast produced. So we have the guys in the Philippines, and that bought us about 3 or 4 months of podcast production, all of our equipment, and got us off to that start. So because the podcast itself, probably to get to the point that we're at now, it would have cost us $10,000 had we not done, actually probably more, probably $12,000 to get to the profitable point, which we're at now. And I think it's going to be very profitable for us in the future, especially if we keep growing at even 10% for the next 12 to 24 months. But unless you're very lucky, unless you have a really, really big database behind you, then you've got to go through a hard period to get to the profitability that we're at, I suppose.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And Bill, what do you think is your biggest secret, your biggest suggestion, or the strategy that you have used to grow your podcast to the numbers that it's in now and to keep it growing month after month? What do you think has helped you the most?
Well, look, we've had a couple of things, I suppose, but we started off doing absolutely everything under the sun. So we would record our shows, and every month we would update them to. We had about 50 Facebook groups on Facebook that we would chuck out an update of everything that's been happening, and we spent a lot of time growing our social medias and so on and so forth. We've added our radio update to our database, which we weren't originally doing. But at the end of the day, I think it is just about really creating the best content that you have. So I think before you start up the podcast, if you were thinking of starting one, you really got to find out whether it's going to be you by yourself with a microphone, whether it's going to be you in person with a guest, whether it's going to be you and somebody that you gel with via Skype, whether it's going to be 3 of you and a guest, whether it's going to be 2 people head to head. Just you've got to kind of figure out what's going to work for you, because if it's not quite there, then people just won't listen to it. So luckily, I started off with 2 guys in mind. Unfortunately, one of them had to leave the show just because he had other commitments that just he just wasn't able to put in the work that we needed him to put in early on. And he still works for AdventureFit as a coach, but he's not on the podcast. But I had 2 guys. I had one who I get along with supremely well, who's a really deep's the right word, deep guy. And I had another guy who's another friend of mine who I get along with extremely well, who's just the same, really smart, really switched on. And the thing is, he's a hilarious guy. So it was a really nice trio. Now, since one of the guys, Mac, has left, so it's just me and Tommy. So it's really 2 guys that are kind of 2 gooses on a podcast together. But we've got that connection that just works, because that's the biggest thing. If it's a natural connection, and if you've got the right, with a business podcast like yourself, it's very. I listen to John Lee Dumas a little bit. Yours is obviously one-to-one. You've just got to get the right mix, and then that's the most important part. For me, another thing that's obviously helped us is just reaching out to the guests that are going to get us the most exposure. So if we had Wim Hof on the other day, who's been on Joe Rogan's podcast a couple of times. He's been on the Tim Ferriss show. He's had a Vice documentary, Nat Geo documentary. Like, he's all over the place. So when people see Wim Hof, they want to listen. If you can get the guests to share your show, obviously that's going to be a big bonus. But there's just it's like you said, there's no trick to podcasting. It's just finding that right balance for what works for your show and for your niche. And then if you can get some high level and some quality content with some high level guys and girls on the show, then that's going to help boost it along.
Totally. Thank you for your advice, Bill. Great stuff. And I'd like to go back to Adventure Fit travel a little bit, since that's kind of the main subject of today's show. And I wanted you to share a moment where it was really hard to keep it going. Maybe a moment where you thought you shouldn't be doing Adventure Fit travel and you should just, fold it up and just quit that and go back to construction or anything else, really. When you thought that this business is not for you, it's too hard and something's not working out. What was like your darkest moment when starting and growing?
Look, there's definitely been a bunch. I'm a guy that's pretty. I'm a pretty positive guy normally, and I've gone through some the stress levels early on, and even today to some extent can be really high. And I've gone through some anxiety issues, and just it's really has been hard work. But it's lucky that I'm passionate enough about it to stick with it, and hopefully it'll be the greatest job in the world at some point down the line. But so I used to very, very early on, I used to be in the unenviable position of always having a little shortfall for a trip. So I would have a trip that was running, but I wasn't really able to fund that trip. So I would take money from the trip that was coming up next ahead of time. So I was always robbing Peter to pay Paul, which is a terrible way to run your business. But I didn't start with anything, and I didn't start with any business acumen, and I got myself in a little bit of debt early on, and that just kept rolling over trip after trip after trip, and it would get a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger every time. And then early on, probably a year in or so, we had an accommodation provider on a trip to the US that we did. That accommodation for 7 days was locked in with somebody that I think it might have been $4,000 for the week or something like that, $4,000. And then and most of all my trips at 4 weeks out, at the time it was 4 weeks out, would be cut off date for sales, and then we would finalise all our numbers with all of our accommodations and tour providers. And that's with everybody. Everybody gives you 2 weeks or 7 days or 2 weeks notice. But I didn't read the fine print on our accommodation provider in this particular instance. I thought it was 7 days, but it was actually 5 weeks. I don't know how I made this mistake.
Wow.
But I woke up. So I'm a weightlifter back in Australia, like Olympic weightlifting, the sport. And I'd hurt my back that day. I'd had some back issues over the last couple of years. I'm good now. But I'd hurt my back. So I'd bulged a couple of discs in my back that day. And I also was sleeping on the couch because I was Airbnb-ing my room to get more money in. And for some reason, I had a terrible, terrible habit of checking my emails in the middle of the night at this point. So everything was wrong about this story. At this point in time, I checked my emails in the middle of the night, and I found out that our accommodation provider, which I still hold a bit of a grudge against these guys for doing so, they emailed us and said, "Hey, Mr. Kerr, unfortunately, you didn't provide us with final numbers 3 days ago, so we opened up your accommodation to the public, and now it's been booked out. Sorry for the inconvenience." That was all I got. I didn't get a courtesy email saying, "Hey, can you give us final numbers?" I didn't get a phone call. I got an email a few days later saying that accommodation was finished. So this was in the middle of the night. I was sleeping on my own couch. I just injured my back again, and I figured out that I had no accommodation for a trip that was starting in 4 weeks. So obviously I was never going to get back to sleep at that point. So it's 2 a.m. and I'm sitting in my house looking at accommodations for the middle of summer in LA for a massive group of people traveling, and everything was sold out. And what ended up happening was I spent 4 or 5 hours till the sun came up trying to find accommodation. I found something that was $4,000 or $5,000 more expensive than the accommodation that we had booked, but it was the only thing that was really available for a large group in LA. So I had to bite the bullet there and just take a $5,000 hit. But at that stage, right then and there, if you had have given me an easy out and just said, "Hey, we can pretend like this never happened. There'll be no debt. No one will know that you failed," so on and so forth, I probably would have taken it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I mean, having said that, I got through it and everything's good. But starting, that was my fault. That was a problem that came because I wasn't organized enough. So obviously for somebody like me, unless you're so on top of absolutely everything, it might never happen to you. But for someone like me, I've made a lot of mistakes along the way, and you just got to make sure that when you make a mistake like that, you got to make sure that it's not going to be a mistake that's going to cost you $5,000, and B, that if you make a mistake, then you don't do that again. So from now on, we have structures in place to make sure that everything's locked in and finalised by the correct time, and then that problem will never happen again. As long as you're learning, then everything's good. But I've definitely learned a few things the hard way, and that was probably the toughest little section I've had.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's pretty crazy story, man. Thanks for sharing that with us.
No worries.
All right, Bill. So now you're doing quite a few different things at this point, and do you think that are you planning to keep the Adventure Fit Travel as your main business and your most profitable business, or do you think there is a chance that you'll be spending a lot more time concentrating on podcast and maybe building a different kind of a brand that kind of goes away a little bit from the actual traveling and doing those retreats?
That's incredible that you've asked me that question, Alex, because it's like you've just infiltrated my brain and because I've got a business coach. I've got a business coach these days, which is great. I recommend that to anyone. And we've been tossing up, okay, how can we really capitalize on the brand that I've built? So I've built a brand. I haven't built a business because it's not absolutely spinning money yet. I've built a brand that now we can take anywhere. It's got everything. The following's great. Everyone wants to work with us. That's what we've been able to do. So the podcast started off as Adventure Fit Travels podcast, Adventure Fit Radio. Mm-hmm. But before long, it kind of got to the point where it was like, okay, I see this becoming a huge, huge part of what we do. And it could even become bigger than travel. So for me, it didn't make any sense to have this huge podcast and media arm of this travel company that I'm not sure if we're going to be the next Intrepid Travel or one of the biggest travel companies in the world. We're very niche, so we're probably not going to be. So it's exactly like what you said. We're actually adventurefit.com is owned by somebody. ADVF, which is our synonym, is .com is owned by somebody. But we are just in the last 2 weeks, we took travel off our website, just off the header. So instead of saying Adventure Fit Travel, and then it used to say about us, trips, podcast, store, blog, whatever. Mm-hmm. Now it says, instead of Adventure Travel, it says Adventure Fit, and then it's, instead of saying trips and podcast, it says travel and radio. So what we see in the future now is we see Adventure Fit being the brand with travel, radio, possibly events that we're looking at doing. So as in bringing in keynote speakers, probably basing them in Melbourne and LA, doing events, and media. So growing our YouTube channel and trying to monetize that. Mind you, the YouTube channel, it's still a ways off, but it's exactly like what you said. I think in the future, I see Adventure Fit as the brand, and I see a lot of different things that will fall under that umbrella.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And I asked you because, when you talk about the podcast and a few other things, you seem very, very passionate about those things. And I've seen that happen to some other people, some other brands, where they start with one thing, and as they grow, as they expand their business and their reach and their presence, they understand that the value for them is in something else, that they prefer doing something else that was just a side thing to the brand and is now becoming in the spotlight of the whole brand. And yeah, as you said, sometimes it just makes sense, and I guess you have to experiment and see on your own results that you're getting what kind of direction you should be taking with the whole brand.
That's right. I think Red Bull's a perfect example of that. So we use Red Bull as an example, as kind of something that we aim towards. So Red Bull sell energy drinks, but in Australia, if you walk through a supermarket, I don't know if I could find a Red Bull. I don't know if there would be one in there. I don't know if you'd walk into a service station and you'd find a Red Bull. I genuinely don't. I don't remember the last time I saw a Red Bull can, but I see Red Bull everywhere. Red Bull all over YouTube, Red Bull with all their social media. So they do events now. They're a media company,
Yep.
basically. And they started off. Obviously, they made a lot of money through Red Bull, which got them off and started, and then they were able to build their brand that people recognised. But they're a perfect example of somebody who started off in one direction and then diverged and ended up somewhere else. I looked at this is totally off topic, but I was looking at just scrolling through the Facebook feed last night, which I try not to do, but I was just getting sucked into Facebook, and I saw the story of Nokia, the phone company.
Yeah.
So Nokia started in 1865 as a rubber manufacturing company in 1865, and then 35 years later they entered the electrical industry. So, and then from there they started manufacturing electrical parts in like 1920s, and it wasn't until 1960 that they came out with any sort of phone. Obviously, they've kind of fallen by the wayside somewhat in the last however many years. But, you know, I think AdventureFit will really succeed, and it will be a great success. But I would guess that if I was to see what AdventureFit looked like in 10 years, if you showed me it today, I think I'd be shocked.
Yeah, totally. That makes sense. And it was a nice example that you mentioned, the Red Bull. Well, here in Canada, we have Red Bull pretty much anywhere, any corner shop, any supermarket, you'll find loads of Red Bull. So that's different. But to me also, over the past years, I've associated Red Bull with extreme sports, skateboarding, whatever.
Yeah.
And just a few months ago, I started noticing, and this is, well, at least in Montreal, right? And we're pretty big city. We're, 2-3 million people, Montreal and surroundings. And I started noticing we have these ads everywhere. It's called, how is it called? Red Bull Music Academy. I think that's what it's called.
Right.
So it's basically Red Bull, as you mentioned. They're becoming a media company, but the way they launched it here, it's like all of a sudden, and they're everywhere, and this whole bunch of really weird and interesting events popping up, and it's all sponsored or funded by or started by Red Bull Music Academy. And that's, thinking about it, it's pretty incredible from where they started and what they're doing now.
Well, one of the guys that I wanted to get on my podcast, and we're obviously still working on him, and maybe not until we have big numbers listening to us in 5 years' time, we'll be able to get him. But it's Felix Baumgartner, and I don't know if you know Felix, but he's the guy that skydived from outer space.
Yes, I've heard of him. Yes, I've seen
the
video.
That was Red Bull Stratus, I think was the event. So they funded a guy to skydive from outer space. That's pushing the boundaries of humanity. It's kind of like a throwaway thing that they did, but it's something that's never been done before that you wouldn't even fathom. You would never think that somebody would in their right mind would do that, and that was sponsored by Red Bull. So yeah, it's a great example. They're a great benchmark to kind of look towards, I suppose.
Yeah, and here we are advertising Red Bull on the podcast.
Yeah. Hashtag Red Bull.
Yeah.
Send us some cans.
Yeah, send us some free drinks. All right, Bill. So as we're approaching the end of this podcast, I wanted to ask you one last question, I guess, and it's a pretty serious one. What would be your biggest suggestion to any beginner entrepreneur or someone who is just thinking of starting their business in any field, really? What would be the most important thing you would suggest to them?
Okay, so I'm gonna waffle on a little bit here, but I'm gonna give 3 steps.
Sure.
3 steps. If you're a budding entrepreneur and you want to go out and start something, I would say before you have any money or while you're starting out, while things are tight, which they normally are, then do what I did. I can't recommend it highly enough, to just always be putting yourself in front of people that are more learned than you in any field you need. So spend some time with somebody in marketing, spend some time with somebody in sales, spend some time with somebody who's run a business before, and just find out what worked, and just get that free advice. That's so crucial, because when you're starting out, it's so hard to get good advice, and you have to try and find somebody that that can kind of help you and guide you a little bit. That's not going to cost you an arm and a leg, because obviously starting out, you got to kind of bootstrap things, and you got to save every penny that you can. Then I would say the next stage that I got to for myself is when I wanted to upscale my business, I went out and I hired a VA in the Philippines. I now have 3, and I pay $6 US per hour, $8 Australian, basically for for my VAs. I have 3 full-time, 40 hours a week VAs, and these guys are fantastic, absolutely amazing. If anyone wants to ask about how I use my VAs or how I got my VAs, they can email me. And that's been great for us because we're able to get cheap help. Really, these guys get paid well in the Philippines, but for us in Australia, in Canada, in the US, it's very, very manageable. It's and that allowed me to get more done and to build the business faster. And then my third recommendation, which would be after you've grown your business to a point where you do have a little bit of money that you can put into some other places, would be to go out and get a business coach. And you can nearly start a business if you had a little bit of money lying around. You can nearly start a business with a business coach, because the idea of a business coach is, so I pay, I don't know, something like 2,500 Australian dollars per month, which a lot of people will say is a lot of money. But the idea of a business coach is, my business coach either saves me or makes me much more than that per month. Businesses with business coaches outperform businesses without by a lot more than what the business coach costs them, if that makes sense. So that's something that I wish I had have done a lot earlier. So that's probably 3 stages of business, and well, not the only 3 stages, but the 3 stages that I've been through. Startup, get in front of your friends and family, get people to help you out. Secondly, get some cheap help on board before you start employing people if it works in your business. And then once you can, try and invest in a business coach to just guide you in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. Great advice, man. Thank you for sharing that. And for people who want to find out more about Adventure Fit Travel, maybe book a trip, or want to listen to your podcast, or maybe get in touch with you, what's the best way? Where should they go?
Yeah, cool. So adventurefittravel.com is our website. So if you look at travel or radio there on the menu bar, you'll find our trips and our podcast. Our podcast, also, the easier way to find it is just Adventure Fit Radio on iTunes and Stitcher. Myself, if you want to hit me up about anything that you heard on today's show that I can help you out with, you want more information about how I work with my VAs, for example, then head to email me at doc@adventurefittravel.com. We're Adventure Fit Travel on all the socials. I am Doc's Adventure Fit Life on Instagram. That's pretty much it, man.
All right. Thanks so much for sharing. Bill, thank you so much for your advice, your experiences, and sharing your story. Thank you for being on the show.
Thanks, Alex. It's been a pleasure, man. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of the Extra Paycheck Podcast. As usual, I will be putting up a show notes page at extrapodcast.com/85. This is where you will be able to find links and resources mentioned in today's episode. Also, head over to extrapodcast.com/iTunes in order to subscribe to the show. Also, leave a rating and a review, which will help this show tremendously. Thank you so much once again for tuning in, and I'll talk to you next Monday.